There are many households in the United States where children are being raised by grandparents. Many of these families face special challenges. Donna Butts is the executive director of Generations United, an organization working to assist grandfamilies. So good to have you in the studio to talk about this very important issue. How many children currently are being raised by grandfamilies?
Well, it's wonderful to be with you too. Thank you.
Thank you.
In children who are being raised just by grandparents, there are 2.7 million children in the country who are in households that report that the grandparents are solely responsible for them. But there are about 7.8 million who are living in grandparent-headed households, meaning that the parents may be there full-time or part-time.
And let's talk about the African American community for a moment, because obviously there are more whites in this country, so the number would be larger amongst that group. But when it comes to a percentage, talk to me about that.
Well, there are a larger number of African American children that are being raised by their grandparents in terms of the percentage of the population. I went back and I looked, and for children up to the age of 18, about 11 will end up in care with the grandparents. It's 1 in 11, excuse me. In African American communities, it's 1 in 5. So it's over double what it would be in another population.
And let's talk about some of the reasons why this happened. And I think I told you a story about, you know, talking with a lady, and she had a young kid who was driving me nuts. And I said, what's going on? Are you taking care of her? And she said, yes, my daughter's in prison, so I'm now having to take care of my granddaughter. And this woman she told me she was 65 years old. She should be able to be retiring, going to get her toes done, sitting in the sunshine. Instead, she's having to deal with an overactive child.
No, it's really, really difficult. There's a number of reasons why grandparents step in, and they need to step in. It could be substance abuse, it can be incarceration, it can be mental illness, it can be poverty because the parent just doesn't have the money to support the child. But it can also be the death of a parent. For example, with the wars that we've been fighting the last many years, more and more grandparents have had to step in because their children have either been killed in battle or injured so severely. The grandparents need to step in and help raise the children. So there are a number of reasons why it occurs, but I've never met a grandparent who said they'd say no if a grandchild was on their doorstep.
Absolutely. And you know, it's just, I think what hurts me so much is that I do want them to have their chance to retire. And in a lot of these situations, the grandparent is raising them until either the child is old enough to leave or the grandparent dies.
You're very right. I remember a grandfather I met in Portland, Oregon once, and he was head of a huge youth service organization, and he and his wife had taken in their 2 granddaughters. His wife had quit working, but he told me he would work until he died. Because basically by the time it came for him to be at retirement age, the grandchildren would just be going into college, and he was going to have to continue to work and work. But again, they were not saying that because they wanted sympathy so much as just the acknowledgement that that was what their lives were now.
Yeah, this is the reality. And I think there's a stereotype out there that when grandparents are involved, it is a single grandparent, but that's not true.
No, it's not always the case. There are a number of single grandparents who are raising grandchildren, but the majority are married couples, and they oftentimes have to make that decision that one of them won't be working any longer so that they can help to provide the care and the support that's needed for the children. I mean, think about it, getting them to sporting events, to school, to doctor's appointments. I had a grandmother in Illinois who I adore, and she's raising her grandson, Joy. And she said people her age will oftentimes talk to her about, well, we're going on this cruise, or I'm going to go do this and that. And she said, well, you know, I cruise too. I cruise to school, I cruise to the doctor's office, I cruise to the grocery store. Joy is my cruise, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
Oh, you know, what will we be without our grandparents? I'm going to tear up here. How is the situation different for grandparents raising their children state by state? Because it is a state by state sort of a basis that we kind of go on.
You're really right, Angela. It varies state by state, which is one of the reasons why we have a website that's grandfactsheets.org. and it has a fact sheet for every state as far as what the laws are, what the support groups are, some of the services that grandparents can seek out, because each state is different in terms of whether they qualify for financial support, whether they can easily access education, whether they can easily access medical care. So you really need to know what the state has on the books for the families.
Can you think of any state that you were impressed with the amount of support they provide grand families?
I think one of the states that has done a really wonderful job pioneering and staying with grandparents raising grandchildren is Washington State. They have somebody on their state staff who's focused on kinship care. They have task force. They have passed supportive legislation. They make sure that their grandparents can access the services they're entitled to.
Yeah, this is the same state that has currently a minimum wage of $10 and is looking to raise it to $15. So Washington State continues to lead in so many areas. Let's talk about the fact that a lot of assistance is there to help grand families if they are attached to the foster system versus if they're not a part of the foster care system. Tell me about that.
It is really interesting because the majority of grandparents are raising their children outside of the foster care system. For every child who's in the foster care system that's in kinship care, there are 25 that are outside of the system. So when you think about it, if those children who weren't in the foster care system were to go into the foster care system, it would cost our country more than $6.5 billion a year to provide support for even half of those children, let alone it would also overwhelm the system. So grandparents are doing an invaluable service to our families, to our country, to our children.
Right. Let's talk about some famous people who've been raised by their grandparents. You go ahead, you tell me.
Well, we did a publication that I just love. It's called Grand Successes, Stories of Lives Well Raised. And it profiles well-known people who were raised by their grandparents, as well as some people who weren't well-known. But those include Jamie Foxx, for example, who, if you remember, when he accepted an Academy Award one year, he said, "This is for my grandmother."
Yes.
It includes Kelly Pickler, who named her, she's a country singer, who named her motorhome after her grandmother who raised her. It includes President Barack Obama, who, if you remember, when he accepted the nomination, said, I'm here because of my grandmother.
Absolutely.
She poured everything she had into me. The head of McDonald's, the CEO of McDonald's, talks about the grandmother that raised him, that took him out of some dangerous streets and made sure he got into school, got into college, and made his way through life. So it's everyday people, but it's people who are really well known. And that's what's wonderful for the grandparents and for the children, is to see it can be worth the struggle, it can be worth the difficult times, because this could be the outcome.
Absolutely. All right, I want to spend the few seconds we have left talking about what else your organization, Generations United, does.
Generations United really advocates for programs and policies that value and engage people across the lifespan, that we value people who are older and who are younger, that they have contributions to make to each other and to their communities. So we promote programs, whether it's mentoring, tutoring, chore programs that help older adults remain in their own homes, programs where we do intergenerational dialogues in community, because older and younger people bring such wisdom and different perspectives to community problems. So we really look at each generation as a resource to our communities and to each other.
That's wonderful.
Thank
you so much for what you do.
Thank you.
Donna Butts, Executive Director of Generations United. We're happy to have you on the show, and we're happy to have you focus on grand families.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
We'll be right back.